A day of fast-paced developments. I'm now joined by Ambassador John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to US President Donald Trump and former US Ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Bolton, welcome. Welcome to India First, sir. Ambassador, Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister Ishaq Dar has just told a foreign media channel that India turned down a US offer to mediate between India and Pakistan, perhaps alluding to the ceasefire in May after Operation Sindoor. Does this indicate that President Donald Trump claiming that he ensured a ceasefire between India and Pakistan is not true? India had always said the US had no role to play. Now Pakistan's Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister has conceded India turned down any third-party mediation.
Well, it's certainly a pretty remarkable statement from the Pakistani side, but consistent with what my own understanding was, that as in prior examples of increased tensions and even military activity between India and Pakistan, ultimately it was the leaders of the two countries that turned the dial down and restored peace. So, Donald Trump has been after a Nobel Peace Prize for some time, and he said in the United States in his first 6 months, he solved 6 wars, one of which I think he meant to include was India and Pakistan. This would seem to be a pretty convincing statement by a very senior Pakistani official that indeed no outsider had a role here. It really was resolved between India and Pakistan.
Ambassador Bolton, US Trade Representative Brendan Lynch is in New Delhi, and this is the first in-person meeting between India and the US on trade once the negotiations were stalemated or broke down. Do you see this as forward movement by both the countries or a climb down by the US? Is there a reset, or would you see this merely as a holding operation?
Well, I think at least some people in the Trump administration understand that the various actions the White House had taken had really gotten a very poor reception.
Okay.
There need to be steps taken to bring the relationship back to an even keel. I certainly hope that's right. I know that in India there was some feeling that Trump had acted very abruptly back in August, where he cut off, if I'm not mistaken, a scheduled negotiation meeting and simply said, well, I'm going to impose 25% tariffs on India. If that's accurate, I think that was a mistake. I do think the two sides were reasonably close to an agreement, and maybe if they can get back to the table, they can reach one, at least on the so-called economic tariffs.
Okay. But Ambassador, help us understand. Now, US may call India a strategic partner. US President Donald Trump may refer to Prime Minister Narendra Modi as a very dear or a very good friend. But the US is also seen to be asking G7 countries to impose sanctions on countries like India at a time when there is talk of resumption of trade dialogue between India and the US.
Well, I think, unfortunately, it's a measure of how Donald Trump operates. He does not himself think strategically. He doesn't consider how one issue is handled may impact another issue. I don't think he appreciates the reality that despite the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the only country that's been penalized for the sale or purchase of Russian oil and gas has been India. There have been no sanctions, no additional tariffs on Russia. And no sanctions, no additional tariffs on China. Some believe that what Trump is saying to the Europeans actually is just another ploy so that he doesn't have to impose further sanctions on Russia. I can't say that for sure one way or the other, but it's a very unusual statement by Trump and reflects the reality, unfortunate though it may be, that he's such an aberration that trying to track his policy, quote unquote, is almost impossible.
Because you've described Trump's trade policy as an enormous mistake and entirely counterproductive for the United States of America. Why do you believe so, sir?
Well, I think it is an enormous mistake. I think it's an enormous mistake almost across the board to go to war with all of our trading partners, Canada, Mexico, Europe, Japan, India, the whole world. There are, I think, bad actors in the international trade environment. I think China is the principal bad actor, but the way to deal with China would be to get all of our friends together and say, we're all victims of China stealing our intellectual property, subsidizing their enterprises against ours, not opening their domestic market, although they've repeatedly said they would. But instead, Trump chose to go to trade war with the whole world. I think it's a huge mistake.
Ambassador Bolton, look at the kind of language that was initially used by US President Donald Trump, and then the language that is used by some of his key advisors, from calling India a dead economy to saying India will say sorry and come to the talks table in a month or two, or India being incorrectly described as laundromat for Kremlin. In your view, sir, why the use of such language, and will this impact the overall strategic partnership?
Well, I hope not. I think the language is unfortunate. I believe in direct talk myself, but I also believe in many times the best way to do it is privately. Look, there's a history here. That's not something that Trump appreciates, but we do need to think strategically. We need to think about the long term. I think leaders like Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe were thinking over the long term when he pushed the concept of the Asian Security Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the U.S. I think that insight remains valid, and I think that's what we ought to be pursuing, not tearing ourselves apart here over these trade issues and issues like how to deal with Russia. I think the way you handle that is to try and find a way for India to find other sources of supply for oil, increase production in the U.S. and other producing countries to keep the price down. There are alternative ways to get to the right result here.
And how do you see India's quiet diplomacy? Though, each time there was a harsh word that came from the United States, India did not respond to it officially. I mean, there may have been a statement or two officially from the spokesperson, but no response to that ugly rhetoric from that MAGA ecosystem in the United States of America. Has that held India in good stead?
Well, I think most people in the U.S. who have followed it respect that. And I think that's the only prudent way to behave. If when people get angry and strike back at some of the rhetoric you hear from Trump supporters, it doesn't make things better. It may make people feel good for a short time, but over the long term, it's not productive. These are not people who really appreciate the complexities of the international environment, or how to determine what U.S. interests are in a very complex and shifting context. And if we had more leaders in the administration who could do that, I think we'd be in better shape. But we've got to make do with what we have for the moment.
Okay. Though you've gone on record to say you don't consider Sergio Gore qualified to be U.S. ambassador to India, even though President Trump has described him as a trusted aide. There are many in America who are advising India that, Sergio Gore is a good idea. He has President Trump's ear. Why, in your opinion, is Sergio Gore not qualified to be U.S. ambassador to India?
Well, I don't think he has any experience in any aspect of international affairs. And the asset that he has is that he's close to Trump. But the problem is if he misappreciates the situation in India, if he doesn't understand what's being communicated to him, he can feed bad information back to the Oval Office, which would only make what's already become a difficult situation even worse.
Ambassador Bolton, there are some in the United States who are not very happy about India being a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or even BRICS. In your view, does that have the potential to adversely impact India-US ties, especially under Trump administration?
Well, I think it's neither of these organizations really have substance to them. They're appearance organizations. I think for a country like India, some of the associate countries in the BRICS aren't ones that ultimately you want to associate with. But I think the main thing is not to me always is not the symbolism, not the PR. It's the substance. And I think if we worked on the substance of the relationship, trying to make it closer economically, trying to have significant and in-depth discussions of the strategic environment, that's the best way to proceed.
And Ambassador, given this blow hot, blow cold tactics being adopted by the US right now when it comes to trade, is it likely to have an impact on Quad? Will President Donald Trump visit India for Quad in your view? Should he? Is it as much in US interest as it is for the rest of the Quad partners?
Look, I think it'd be in Trump's own advantage to come to India to not just through social media, but through direct personal contact with Prime Minister Modi to try and reestablish or repair their relationship. Personal relationships are very important to Trump because he thinks he understands those, even if he doesn't understand much else. And I do think President Modi and he had a good way of communicating. And sometimes it's important for the two leaders to talk directly and get their aides and advisors out of the way.
Now, because of these trade negotiations, has the overall India-US relationship, both countries had invested heavily in it for the past 25 odd years post-Kargil, has that strategic partnership been damaged? Many in India ask, can US be trusted to be a reliable partner?
Well, I think the trade issue has caused the U.S. a lot of damage around the world. It's a totally unforced error, totally unnecessary. I do think it can be fixed, but I think the sooner we get about trying to repair it, the better the chances are that we'll succeed. So I wouldn't waste any time. It may be that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump could speak by telephone in the next few weeks. I think that would be a very good first step.
And what's your assessment as former National Security Advisor of the United States of America of China's show of strength in Beijing with that military parade recently? Is China's military power, China's strategic power, is it coming of age?
Well, I think it was an effort to project the image of a fully mature global power. I don't think that's an accurate description. If you look at the problems inside the Chinese economy and other domestic problems they have, but the whole thing was a propaganda show from legitimizing the Chinese Communist Party's role in defeating Japan in World War II. Turned out the U.S. didn't really have much of a role in that operation. And it's the message is as much for the countries along the Chinese periphery as for the U.S. to try and portray China as a more dependable, more stable partner. It has an appeal when you have leaders who zigzag back and forth all the time. And but again, it's if you understand Trump to have only 3.5 years left in office, that's a blip in history, and you need to look at the longer term picture.
Okay. Ambassador John Bolton for joining me here on this India First special broadcast on India Today. Many thanks, sir.